Good morning, everybody. We're live here from the birdhouse. We are rounding out the month of June, and today we're talking about attracting butterflies and hummingbirds to your backyard. Some tips on butterfly gardening. So, today I'll go over some of the different diversity of butterflies you can find in the area, as well as what plants that you can put in your garden to help attract them. So, as always, we love to know what kind of things you are seeing out and about. If you have any sightings, absolutely put those in the comments. If you have any butterfly and hummingbird plants that you recommend, absolutely put those in the comments too. Or you can just always say hi. So we will get started. The First of all, what I like to talk about is just the whole biology of butterflies, because they do have specific requirements for each stage of their development, which can make butterfly gardening a little bit different than hummingbird gardening. So keep in mind, butterflies are insects. So they start off their life as an egg. That egg hatches and out pops the larva or caterpillar, and that caterpillar will form some kind of a pupa or chrysalis, and then out of that chrysalis will hatch the adult. So the butterflies, in order to have a really robust butterfly garden, you do need to have plants for each stage of their development. So the adult butterflies, you might see them flying around in your garden, sipping nectar from beautiful flowers, which is great. But then you also do need those plants that the butterflies will lay their eggs on. And those are called host plants or larval plants. And each species does have different requirements depending on what that caterpillar will eat. And so that's what I'm going to focus on too, are not only the nectar producing plants, but those plants that the caterpillars need in order to eat. So butterflies and moths have larvae called caterpillars, and those caterpillars have mouths that are made for chewing, and they spend their whole time as a caterpillar just eating and eating and eating and growing. And so in the bottom left here is a picture of a caterpillar mouth. It's a zoomed in photo there of the caterpillar, and they just chew and chew and chew. It's kind of like the Very Hungry Caterpillar book. They definitely just eat and eat and eat. And so they eat lots of plant material. And then once they have reached their butterfly stage, they have a mouth that will suck like a straw. So they have a proboscis that they dip into flowers and they get the nectar out. Butterflies and moths are part of an order called Lepidoptera, which means scaled wing. And if you look at this close-up here of a butterfly wing, you can see all those little tiny scales, and that's what gives them color. So as the butterfly gets older, those scales tend to fall off, or they might get rubbed off, and then they start to look more drab. Sometimes their wings look a little ratty. Most butterflies don't live for longer than a couple of weeks. So if you see a really, really brightly colored butterfly, they probably just hatched out of their chrysalis. If you see one that's looking kind of drab in color, it's probably been around for a while. So if you've ever touched a butterfly wing, you might find that you get kind of a powdery residue on your hands. That's all the little scales from their wings. So you definitely don't want to handle butterflies because their wings are so delicate. If you're ever trying to identify if you have a butterfly or moth, there are differences between the two, and the looks can sometimes be deceiving. Not all butterflies are super colorful, and not all moths are really drab in color. So there are ways, though, to tell the differences between the two. Butterflies will have antenna with some kind of a ball or projection on the end where it gets larger at the end of their antenna, whereas moths have an antenna that's either perfectly straight or it looks like a feather. And butterflies tend to be diurnal or active during the day. And all of our butterflies here are diurnal, whereas most moths are nocturnal. We do have some moths that are active during the day, and I'll show you one in this presentation here today. While at rest, butterflies tend to hold their wings upright over their body, and moths tend to have their wings spread out. It's another way to tell the difference between the two. And butterflies will form a hard-shelled chrysalis, whereas the moths will form a cocoon or something that has a whole bunch of fibers around it. And inside those fibers are a pupa. But there are differences between butterflies and moths. And here's some pictures to kind of show you some of those differences. Here is a close-up on the top of the different antenna types. And so this butterfly here, this insect on the top left, that is a butterfly. You can see its antenna gets a little larger at the end. It has these little balls or projections on the end, whereas the moth antenna is either perfectly straight or looks like feathers. And then in the bottom left, here is a swallowtail that has just hatched out of its chrysalis. And here is what a moth cocoon looks like, a whole bunch of fibers there that's usually wrapped up in a leaf or somewhere really inconspicuous. So those are some ways to tell the differences between butterflies and moths. But if you're trying to attract any of these insects, you need to plant for all stages of their development, because the adults may pass by and sip on nectar from the blooming flowers, but you also do need the plants that the adults can lay their eggs on for those caterpillars to eat. So having a mix of nectar-producing plants and host plants is definitely key for attracting a large amount of butterflies. So here are some of the different types of butterflies we have in the area. Start off with some called skippers, and skippers tend to have a pretty triangular body, and when they fly, it kind of looks like they're skipping through the air. Their caterpillars will feed on grasses and some plants that people tend to do vegetable gardening with, like green beans and peas. So they can be quite common in backyards, especially these orangish colored skippers. And we have many, many different species of the skippers around the area, but they can be common because their caterpillars will feed on grasses. And right now, be on the lookout for what are called eastern-tailed blues or spring azures. And those are really small little butterflies that when at rest, when their wings are up over their body, they look white. But then when they open up their wings, they are really beautiful, bright blue. They're really little butterflies, but their caterpillars will feed on dogwood trees and blueberry, clover. And the eastern-tailed azure is this one on the left. If you look really, really closely, you can see on the bottom of its wing, on its hind wing, there's these two little things that look like tails. And that's how it gets its name, the eastern-tailed blue. And then there's also the spring azure that you can find out now too. And there's also one called the summer azure. So we do have some different species of these little blue butterflies. They're in a group of butterflies usually just called the little blues. Cabbage white butterflies are probably the most common butterfly you'll find in your yard and garden. Their caterpillars feed on quite a few different things, including cabbage, kale, bok choy, Brussels sprouts, broccoli. They're super common in backyards and gardens. If you find that some of your veggie plants are disappearing and you can't tell why, it's not a bunny, it's not a groundhog, it could be cabbage white butterflies. Their caterpillars tend to blend in really well with the leaves of some of their host plants. So they're bright green, just like some of those plants that they eat. So they can be hard to pick out sometimes in the garden. If you see a big, bright yellow, showy butterfly, it's probably going to be the eastern tiger swallowtail. They're pretty common around here too. Their caterpillars tend to feed on larger trees, things like American hornbeam, tulip trees, wild cherry. So you might see them flying high up in the treetops, and that's where they'll lay their eggs. The females can be dimorphic, meaning they can look different from the males. Most of the tiger swallowtails you'll see around here are bright yellow like this, but the females can be very dark in color. So if you ever see something that looks like a black swallowtail, but if you look really close, you can still see little stripes on it, that is going to be a female eastern tiger swallowtail. So another pretty common butterfly that we have around here. If you are in a wooded area, you might get spicebush swallowtail. Their caterpillars will feed on sassafras and spicebush, and they're a black-colored caterpillar or black-colored butterfly, and then their caterpillars look like this picture here on the top. They have eye spots So these spots here on the top of the caterpillar aren't really its eyes. Those are just its coloration to warn predators or to make predators think that it's bigger than it is. And that's not uncommon with some of these swallowtail species, but those are not its eyes. Its head is actually down here quite far below those eye spots. And so while it's feeding, it still looks like it's looking up with those big, big eyes. So that's the spicebush swallowtail. This is one that you might find in your garden, though. This is the black swallowtail, and this is what the caterpillar looks like. The caterpillar will feed on some herb-style plants, things like dill and fennel, parsley, even Queen Anne's lace. When disturbed, they have what's called an orange osmeterium, and the top picture shows what that is. It's this projection that comes out of its head when disturbed, and it emits a foul-smelling odor. That's a way to warn off predators. So if you do happen to come across one of these in your garden, and if you give it a little poke, you might see it rear up on its legs and flare out this orange osmeterium, which is really pretty wild. This is what the adults look like. So they can look a little different from one another too. Sometimes they'll have a lot of yellow. Sometimes they won't have much yellow at all, but they always have a little black polka dot here in the red section of their hind wing, which is how you can identify them as being different from that spicebush swallowtail or the black morph of the eastern tiger swallowtail. So they can be common if you're doing herb gardening in your garden. There's also what's called a giant swallowtail, which aren't as common, but they are quite large, and their caterpillar mimics a bird's dropping. So you might not even notice it in the garden, and they feed on citrusy plants and things like hops. So we do have them around. I happen to have one in my front yard last summer, flying around really briefly, and then it was gone. But their caterpillar also has that orange osmeterium that will pop out of its head if disturbed. So pretty wild there. Some other types of butterflies that aren't as big as the swallowtails that we do have around here are going to be things like the Baltimore checker spot. This is a really gorgeous small butterfly, mostly black in color with bright orange and white spots. Their caterpillar is also bright orange and black. They'll feed on plantain, white turtlehead, beard tongue, and false foxglove. You can find these usually around more wet areas, things like marshes, bogs. You can find them in fields. And the caterpillars, the adults tend to lay their eggs in groups. So the caterpillars are usually all together on one plant. So if you see one caterpillar, you're likely to see at least a dozen of them. So really cool species there. We also have things that are in a group called the angled wing butterflies, the question mark and the comma. And the caterpillar will feed on hops, nettle, basswood trees, and they'll also sip on sap and fruit from trees. And these two species look super similar to one another, but if you look very closely when they're at rest, when their wings are held over their body, the question mark has this little symbol on its wing that looks like a question mark. It's almost like a little, an angled little line and then a polka dot underneath it. That's how it gets its name, because it does look like a little question mark on its wing. If it doesn't have that little tiny dot, then it is called the comma. So they can be really hard to tell the difference between one another, but we do have both around. We also have the mourning cloak butterfly. We talk about this species a lot in the early spring because they do overwinter as adults. So they do hibernate as an adult butterfly. So this is one of the first species you tend to see in the spring. When it warms up, they are out flying around. You can sometimes even come across them in the winter during a warm day in the winter. They sometimes get stirred up and they will fly around in the middle of the winter. Their caterpillar feeds on larger trees also, things like willow, cottonwood, aspen, and poplar, super common trees we have around here. So it is a pretty common butterfly, especially if you've got a nice wooded area around you. Red admiral, you might see them passing by in your garden. They fly really fast, kind of erratically. They feed on nettles. So the caterpillars will eat nettle species. And they are also migratory. They have big population booms and busts. And so there's some years where they're really, really common. But this is a very dark butterfly with some red stripes on its wings. So that is the red admiral. And the viceroy butterfly is a mimic of the monarch butterfly. So if you see something that looks like a mini version of a monarch butterfly, could very well be this viceroy species. They are smaller than the monarch, and then they also have this stripe that goes through their hind wing. If you can see that there, the monarch does not have that. So that's one way to tell the differences between the two. The caterpillars feed on poplar, willow, and fruit trees, and this is another species you can find usually in wet areas. And of course, the monarch butterfly. This is one that we should start hearing reports of soon because the milkweed is starting to bloom. And these can be quite easy to attract because their caterpillars feed on milkweed species and the adults will drink from the milkweed plants. So planting milkweed is a fabulous way to attract them. And they do migrate. And so we do have a class just all about the monarch butterfly because they do have such an interesting life cycle and migration. They migrate all the way down to Mexico in the fall. So really, really cool butterfly there. And we should start to see them any day now. But if you do see another bright orange butterfly and it's not a monarch, it could be something in the fritillary group. We do have the great spangled fritillary, which is on the top there. That's the picture of the great spangled. And then we also have a meadow fritillary, which are common around here, and they tend to feed on violets, native violet species. So another type of butterfly. But then there's also lots of different moths in the area. Some tend to be more pests, and some. So I thought I would show some of those that tend to be kind of the pest species as well as some others. This is one you might see in your backyard, or you might see these tents as you're out and around. The eastern tent caterpillar will make big silk tents that the group of the caterpillars will hang out in. They'll defoliate the trees. So it's one way for them to be protected inside these big tents of silk. And this is what the caterpillar looks like. They can be, although they're native, they are sometimes considered a pest because they can defoliate trees. That being said, they provide lots of food for birds out there, especially birds like cuckoos really love these caterpillars. So keep that in mind if you do have some in your trees, that they are providing lots of food for the birds out there. But this is a species of moth that we have that can be quite common, especially because those tents of silk are so easy to spot in trees. Then there's also the spongy moth, or what used to be known as the gypsy moth, which is in the news here and there depending on the year because they can have some big population booms as well. And they're known to defoliate lots of trees and shrubs. They're native to Europe, so they are an introduced species. And they're quite interesting because although they tend to prefer deciduous trees, if they start to run out of deciduous trees, they'll also start to eat the pine trees. So certain years there's quite a few of them around, but this is what the caterpillar looks like. It looks kind of similar to the eastern tent caterpillar, but they have almost bluish colored, or maybe a gray, but it looks kind of blue, these blue dots, and then they're followed by some red dots on their body, whereas the eastern tent caterpillar has that stripe that goes down its body, and all of their polka dots are all the same color. So another caterpillar species that we tend to talk about more so in the fall is the woolly bear caterpillar, which turns into the Isabella tiger moth. Their caterpillar will feed on plants that are really common in yards, things like dandelion, plantain, and then just grasses and weeds. The woolly bear is really fun. You tend to see it bumbling around on the ground, walking around quite fast. And there is a myth about the woolly bear caterpillar that's never really been proven, that the longer the middle brown band on the caterpillar, the milder and shorter the coming winter. The shorter the brown band, the longer and more severe the winter will be. And this is the moth it turns into. So it turns into quite a beautiful showy moth as well. And then we've been talking about the giant silk moths, which you can still find out right now. Things like the polyphemus moth, which is one of the more common ones. And these species will feed on larger trees. So that's what they lay their eggs on. And the adults are born without even any mouth parts. So the adults don't live for very long at all. They only tend to live for a couple days. And so they don't even have mouth parts to feed. But those caterpillars will eat and eat and eat. But the adults will not. They just mate and then they die off. So that goes with these other giant silk moths, things like the Cecropia moth, which has a really interesting looking caterpillar up top there. The royal walnut moth, which has a caterpillar called the hickory horned devil, and you can see why from that picture, kind of crazy looking. And then the Luna moth too. So we do have several different species of the giant, these giant moths around. So now is the time to go out looking for them if you are trying to find them, because they are quite seasonal. And then there's also the rosy maple moth, which is quite a bit smaller, but it does feed on maple trees, even silver maple. And their caterpillar kind of looks like a mini version of that hickory horned devil, but the moth itself is bright yellow and pink. Really cool looking insect there. And then there are day flying moths. Things like this one, the hummingbird clearwing moth. So if you see something in your garden that kind of looks like a hummingbird, but you're kind of looking at it and go, is that a hummingbird? Is it a bee? It could very well be this hummingbird clearwing moth. Its caterpillar feeds on viburnum, honeysuckle, fruit trees, hawthorns. They are out during the day, and they are often mistaken for hummingbirds and bumblebees because they do hover at plants just like the hummingbirds do. And butterflies, although we've talked a lot about the plants that can attract them, they also have what's called a puddling behavior. So if you are ever at the side at a pond or the side of a stream bank and you happen to see a bunch of butterflies grouped together, what they're doing is puddling behavior. They tend to land on some muddy or sandy surface, and what they'll do is siphon out the nutrients from the sand or the mud or the soil, and they are getting electrolytes and salts. So they don't just feed on flowers, they'll feed on mud, they'll feed on rotting fruit, they'll feed on animal droppings sometimes. So they don't just feed on flowers. They will often do this puddling behavior. And you can make your own butterfly puddler if you are trying to attract them to your yard. It can't hurt to put out something like this. And we are going to be having a butterfly puddler class, which we will be announcing next week. Looks like it's going to be on July 19th. We're going to have a class where you can come in and make your own butterfly puddler, but you can make one easily just from a lot of materials you might even have at home already. All you need is an old bird bath or an old dish of some kind. And you fill that dish with rocks and sand, and you could even put a little bit of soil in there, and then put some larger rocks on it too, which are bigger than the others, so the butterflies can perch on there. You want to keep that surface moist, not really overflowing with water, but the butterflies will land in there and they'll siphon out some of the nutrients from these rocks and sand and soil. So fun little activity that you can do to help attract butterflies to your backyard. There are also butterfly feeders. The butterfly feeders are similar to hummingbird feeders where they hold nectar, but usually they have some kind of spot you can put fruit out. So you can put fruit on the top of the feeder. And then the butterfly feeders will also have some kind of a wick here. So the wick will bring the nectar up from the basin to the top of the feeder, and the butterflies will land on it and dab at it with their proboscis. So they'll get the nectar out that way. These can attract butterflies. They will definitely attract lots of pollinating insects like bees to your yard. So they can be hit or miss with butterflies. So if you're looking to put something out to attract them, the butterfly puddler is probably the best way to go. But you can always try the feeders too. And then there are butterfly houses. And butterfly houses aren't like a birdhouse where the butterfly will go in there and lay its eggs. These are made for the butterflies that will overwinter as adults. So things like that morning cloak butterfly can wedge itself into here and hibernate for the winter. That's really what these are for. So if you have a butterfly house, your best bet to attract more butterflies to it are to fill it with sticks and tall grasses, things that the butterfly can really wedge into for the winter. However, if you are looking for a house style item to attract pollinators to your yard, bee houses are different. The mason bee houses will attract these bees to your backyard. They'll lay their eggs inside of these houses, and then those eggs hatch. They will pupate and they'll spend all winter in there, and then they'll hatch out in the spring. So the butterfly houses are quite different than the bee houses. So the butterfly houses are more for hibernation, and then the bee houses are really a place for them to lay their eggs and kind of thrive more in the garden. So they do offer different things. And then as far as hummingbirds go to a lot of the same nectar producing flowers that the butterflies go to. So far we've really focused on the host plants that the butterflies like, that the butterflies will lay their eggs on, that those caterpillars will eat. But then at the end, we'll talk about the different nectar producing plants that both the hummingbirds and the butterflies will go to. We have one species of hummingbird here called the ruby-throated hummingbird, a migratory bird that will spend its summers here, and then it'll migrate down to Mexico and Central America in the fall. And here, hummingbirds can be found in a whole bunch of different habitats, including backyards. You can find them in fields, forest edges, meadows, orchards. When they are down in their wintering habitats down in the fall and winter months, they tend to like dry forests, citrus groves, and scrubby habitats. The ruby-throated hummingbirds feed on the nectar of red and orange tubular flowers. That seems to be their preference. They'll dip their long beaks into these flowers, and they also have a long tongue that can dip into the flowers. Sometimes they will eat tree sap. They also will eat insects. They're known to grab insects midair. They'll pull spiders off their spider webs. And they also will use that spider web to hold their nest together. They will weave that in with their nesting material to form their little nests. But here's a picture of the hummingbird perched with its beak and really long tongue. So you can see how they can get into those tubular flowers pretty easily. This is a hummingbird nest. The female will build the nest on a slender branch of a tree. The nest is really small when it first starts out. It's usually about the size of a thimble, and those eggs are really small. They're about the size of Tic Tacs. They build the nest using down from plants, things like dandelion down or thistle down, and they'll weave in spider silk. They'll sometimes put lichen on the outside of it so it's camouflaged. And inside that nest, they'll lay 1 to 3 eggs, usually 2. They can have up to 2 broods a year. They'll sit on those eggs for 12 to 14 days. Once those eggs hatch, after those 2 weeks, the young will stay in the nest for about 3 weeks until they're out in the world. So not only can you attract hummingbirds with plants, but you can also put out a feeder with hummingbird nectar. And the recipe for the nectar is 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. Boil the water, mix in the sugar, let it cool, and you're good to go. You don't need to dye the nectar red. This hummingbird feeder here is red and has red nectar. You really don't need to dye the nectar red. It's not known if the dye can harm the hummingbirds in any way. They don't need the nectar to be red, so you can just have clear nectar. It's totally fine. Hummingbirds are attracted to the color red, though, so having a feeder that's red can definitely help to bring in the birds. You do want to change the nectar frequently. You want to change it out every few days. We have this product called Nectar Defender that is a liquid you can add to your nectar to keep it fresh longer for more like a week. So you can always add a little bit of that to the nectar too if you're not really able to change it out as often. And there's things you can do to help keep insects out, things like ants. We've talked about these in the past, ant moats that you fill them with water and you hang your feeder from them. The ants can't get around that water barrier to get down to the feeder. And then we also have some gel that you can put around your feeder pole or around your feeder, and that will keep the ants from crossing it. It smells like cinnamon, and they don't like the smell of it, and the ants just won't cross it. And then there's, depending on what kind of feeder you have, you can sometimes put bee guards on them to keep bees and wasps out. How these act are, they're just a little flexible membrane that goes on the inside of the feeder, which the hummingbirds can poke through just fine with their beaks, but the bees and wasps can't do that. So there are some feeders that you can put these nectar guard tips on, and that can really help limit the bee and wasp activity at your hummingbird feeders or nectar feeders. And then we also have these fake wasp nests that look like bald-faced hornets nests. These are almost just like a little paper lantern type thing, but they mimic the bald-faced hornet's nest, which are big gray paper nests. And the bald-faced hornets are so territorial that if bees and wasps are around and they see something that looks like that, they think, oh, there's bald-faced hornets around, and they tend to go elsewhere. So we've actually gotten quite good response to these, that these work really well at keeping the bees and wasps away. So if you are trying to attract more hummingbirds and butterflies to your garden, these are some nectar producing plants that can help with that. You want to plant long, brightly colored tubular plants. The color red does draw hummingbirds in. Purples and yellows tend to attract butterflies, and you want to avoid any kind of pesticides. And you definitely don't want to do any kind of spraying, because those will kill the insects that you don't want, but they'll kill all the insects. And so that's definitely a no-no for any kind of butterfly and hummingbird gardening. And you just don't want birds to be eating bugs that have been killed off from pesticides anyway. So it's just not a healthy thing for the wildlife. But here's some different plants that will help to attract some of these butterflies and hummingbirds. So this is a bee balm, which are starting to bloom right now. It comes in different colors. You can get bright red, you can get purples, but this is a native herb, actually, that the butterflies love. And actually, those hummingbird clearwing moths seem to really like the bee balm. I've seen them on bee balm more than I've seen them on other flowers. Columbine, there's native and non-native species, but either way, it is an early spring bloom. So that's great for hummingbirds. It blooms when the hummingbirds are starting to come in for the season. So it is a really good one for them. It's a really good food source for the hummingbirds early on in the season. Lupins, another fabulous non-native. There's non-native versions, there's native versions, but these tall spiky plants are great for the hummingbirds and butterflies. Black-eyed Susans will bloom all summer long into the fall. They're easy to grow, and if you keep the plant stalks up, if you keep those flowers out and the seed heads out, the goldfinches really love it when they go to seed. They'll eat all the seeds out of the seed heads from these plants. So Black-eyed Susan's wonderful. Cardinal flower seems to be a real favorite of the hummingbirds. It will have tall, spiky red flowers, and the hummingbirds absolutely love it. Coneflowers, kind of like the Black-eyed Susans, long blooming, and the goldfinches like the seeds from them once they've gone to seed, but another super easy to grow, fabulous plant for hummingbirds and butterflies. And then there's some vines, things like trumpet vine and trumpet honeysuckle. Trumpet vine is on the left, on the picture on the left. It has really big orange blooms, and so it produces a lot of nectar, but it can get a little unruly as far as spreading. So if you want to plant trumpet vine, you want to be prepared for that, or you want to have a nice large area that you don't mind it taking over. The trumpet honeysuckle, on the other hand, is much easier to maintain and to keep in an isolated area. So they're both vines. The trumpet honeysuckle has thinner, long blooms than the trumpet vine. The trumpet vine has big, big flowers, but they are both really good for the hummingbirds. Things like Joe pieweed are also great for butterflies, especially. There are lots of little flowers here that produce a lot of nectar. It's long blooming. You can find it. You can find it naturally around a lot of places. You can find this in garden centers quite often in their native plant section. Really easy to grow. It gets nice and tall. Looks great in the garden. So that is Joe Pieweed. And a plant that looks similar is the New York ironweed. It can grow quite tall, and it has beautiful purple flowers, and this will bloom later on in the summer. So this is a great late summer into the fall plant. Same as asters, another fabulous fall plant for the butterflies. So it's important to plant things not just that will bloom in the spring and summer, but into the fall, especially for those hummingbirds that are migrating and the butterflies that are migrating, like the monarch butterfly. So goldenrod, if you've got goldenrod popping up in the garden, that can kind of get unruly, but you might want to keep a couple because it is a nice fall blooming nectar producing plant. And sedums, same thing. They bloom later on in the season, so it's really great to have some late blooming flowers for these hummingbirds and butterflies. And then there's others that aren't necessarily natives, but are great at producing lots of nectar. Things like fuchsia. Lantana is a great annual that will produce lots and lots of nectar. Fabulous for butterflies. Gladiolus has tall stalks, lots of nectar. The butterfly bush is like a magnet for butterflies and hummingbirds both. Produces a ton of nectar, so you can't go wrong having butterfly bush as well. But what works in your yard? We love to hear what kind of plants work well in your yard to attract these hummingbirds and butterflies. So if you've got anything that you would recommend, you can absolutely throw them in the comments. Looks like some people are on here. Sharon says, I am fascinated with hummingbirds. I have never found or seen a nest, though. That would be fantastic. Yeah, the nests are so small that they're definitely hard to see. The only times I've heard of people finding a hummingbird nest is if they are seeing a hummingbird that keeps flying into one spot of a tree over and over again. So it's more their behavior that'll show you where the nest is. So yeah, they can be very, very hard to spot because those nests are so small. Stephanie is on and says, I'm curious about the hummingbird swings and little feeders you can hold. Have you seen hummingbirds use them? The hummingbird swings, definitely. We do get reports of the hummingbirds using those. We have these little items called hummingbird swings that you can put around the nectar sources that you're providing for them, and they tend to perch on them and oversee their territory. Because the hummingbirds are quite territorial, they will use those as a spot to sit and look around to make sure there's not other hummingbirds coming in. The hummingbird feeders you can hold, we've heard mixed results on. If you have a lot of hummingbirds coming, then you can probably get them to work. Out west, people get them to work a lot where they have lots of different species of hummingbirds. But here your best bet is if you want to try to attract hummingbirds to feed from your hand is you want to kind of get familiar with what time the hummingbirds are coming to your yard. They tend to come around the same time every day. And then if you can put out some of these small handheld feeders, get them used to coming to the feeders. And then if you go out there with sunglasses on, holding the feeder, sometimes they will feed from them. So it's a mixed bag, but if you're out west, you can definitely get some more use out of those handheld feeders. So it looks like that's everyone's comments and questions for the day. We'll be back on Tuesday with another live stream. And until then, have a great weekend and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.